And so one of my goals, I'll be very explicit in writing this book, was to try to create a shared story about the harms of racism so that it didn't buy into what I think is one of our biggest threats as a multiracial society, which is the zero-sum paradigm of racial competition. The idea that progress for one group has to come at the expense of the other. This zero-sum idea is really the core narrative that threatens this country's prosperity. It's one that is marketed very aggressively by ultimately a pretty small handful of forces and special interests that profit when we are divided. That profit when white Americans have no sympathy for fellow Americans who are people of color who are struggling with the same kinds of issues, struggling with unaffordable healthcare, struggling with job insecurity, struggling with the threats of the coronavirus pandemic, struggling with unaffordable housing, and yet because of race see themselves as somehow on a different team than people of color. The only people who benefit from that are not the white folks who are buying that zero-sum story. They're the folks in the current economic power, the current status of economic power, who are holding all the economic power today, because that undermines our ability to collectively act and work together to make change. So I said, okay, so if we have to confront that zero-sum story, I want to figure out, A, where it came from. You know, this seems sort of not logical, not intuitive, the idea that we as Americans would see our fellow Americans as the enemy, that we would be so stingy to ourselves, that we would disregard the future of the children of the people in this country. So where did it come from? And there I traced it back to the original economic model in our nation, one that was built on stolen land and stolen labor. And in order to justify that massive theft, the loss of life, the inhumanity, the depravity of all of that economic system, we had to create a sense that progress for white people was contingent on the oppression of people of color. So that's where we got that story from. But of course, that's not our economy today. That model no longer serves the economy that we all want today. So why do we still hold it up as a mental model? Why is there still all this language that people adopt? And then public opinion research shows that the majority of white folks are seeing the world through this prism of zero-sum competition, where demographic change is threatening from a sense of not wanting to be a minority in a country where minorities aren't well treated. When of course we know the opposite could be our future. Interestingly, Black and brown folks don't see racial competition as the prism. They don't see that our progress as people of color has to come at the expense of white people. There is a sense that we can all share in all of the hard work and bounty of our great society.